Greetings to you all in the most precious name of our soon coming Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Thank you for taking your time out to study the Gospel of John. And in this video, we will look at the prologue, that's chapter 1, verse 1 to 18. John uses the term logos, or the word, to communicate to both Jews and to the Greeks. The Greeks thought of the term logos as the cause of creation, but they didn't think about logos as a personal being. John agreed with them in saying that the logos is the cause of creation, yet at the same time he emphasizes that he is talking about a personal being, a person. The Jews recall to remembrance the fact that in Genesis, creation begins with a statement, in the beginning, and that phrase is found in John 1 verse 1. Before anything was made, the Word existed. He predates creation. The next two facts that we understand from this passage are as follows in verse 1. The word logos is a distinct person, as understood by the phrase was with God, and having a personal relationship with God. The second fact that we know here is that the Word is equal in essence with God, understood from the fact that the Word was God. At the onset, the author wants to present the fact that the person who is introduced as the Word was distinct from God and with God before creation was made, and at the same time having the essence of deity. So let me repeat that out. The author, John, wants to present the fact that the person whom he introduced as the Word is distinct from God and is with God before creation, and he is God at the same time, having the same essence of the deity. These are the building blocks that we need to understand regarding the doctrine of the Trinity. Before we move ahead in that, let me just give you a few trivia. Useful information. The use of the term word recalls God bringing everything into existence by his speech. He commanded and they were created. God spoke and it was so. The next information we need to know about this passage, the first verse, is regarding a man named Arius who lived in the 4th century. Arius saw Jesus as a created being, and he based his opinion because there was no definite article next to the word God in chapter 1. He translated, or he thought of that verse in John 1 verse 1 like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. That is how Arius thought of that verse, because there was no definite article behind the word God. However, Greek grammar, especially the Caldwell's rule, Greek grammar doesn't require that translation of a God on the lack of definite article, because the lack of a definite article in that sentence doesn't indicate indefiniteness, but it actually specifies that the given term God corresponds to the word, to the term word. So let's examine that phrase, and the Word was God. The definite article behind the term word, the Word. This definite article behind the term word can be used for the other noun in this sentence. We have two nouns in this sentence, and the Word was God. So there is the one noun Word, and there is the other noun God. The definite article behind this term Word can be applied to the other noun in the sentence. So this is how the Greek puts it. Let's understand the doctrine of the Trinity at this point. There are three different persons who share the essence of deity, and they relate to each other in eternity past. Now, Verse 2 and 3 emphasizes that the Word is not a created being. He is the one, or the agency, or the means through whom all creation was made. This statement in verse 2 and 3 is an answer to every Unitarian who is of the opinion that Jesus was just a creation. Now we have more trivia in this passage, useful information. All of what John tells in this section about Jesus is based on what Jesus speaks of himself later in the Gospel. Whatever Jesus talks about himself in John 5 verse 18, John 10 verse 30, John 8 verse 12 and 23 are used by John to give an introduction about Jesus. The three things mentioned in verse 4 and 5, life, light and darkness, continue the reference of Genesis to drive in the fact that God made order out of chaos by bringing light out of darkness, and that God created life on earth. By attesting these activities to Jesus, John makes sure that the readers know that Jesus never depended on anyone for his existence. He himself is the source of life for everyone and everything that existed. Readers should know that whatever was mentioned in Genesis of God is true of Jesus, establishing in the mind of Jewish readers that Jesus is not a rival God to Yahweh, or that he is a man trying to be equal to God. Rather, he is one in essence with the Father. This word, Logos, who is compared to the light that dispels darkness, possesses all the attributes of God in such a powerful manner that when men who are in sin, characterized by darkness, are exposed to the true knowledge of God, his presence and his morality. That is what Jesus is all about. Now, we move to the next section in verse 9 to 13. The one who would eventually dispel sin from the world came into the world that was made through him. The response number 1. There are three responses in here. The first response, the world did not know him. This seems to be a general reference to all of mankind as John continues the light metaphor. Just like darkness stands in stark opposition to the light because of its contradictory natures, the realm of mankind, which is deep rooted in its sinfulness, disassociates with the holiness that Jesus has because it hates the light, as we read in John 3 verse 19. So this is the first response. The world did not know him. The second response, his own did not receive him. Jesus came in the midst of the Jews who have received special revelation and prophecies regarding the Christ, but they didn't receive him. Verse 11 indicates a response that is deliberate, not something that happened out of ignorance. The active voice in this verse tells us that it was deliberate. This rejection will be seen in increasing levels with each passing signs that Jesus would do as convincing proof. So responses number 1 and 2 that we discussed right now suggest an opposition to Jesus because man loved their sins and evil, and no compelling evidence would deter them from turning away from their sins and turning to Jesus. This is how man is hostile. The third response in verse 12, there was a positive response to Jesus. Some received him to place their wholehearted trust in the character revealed in his name. These people who are his creation receive the right to become children of God, a marvelous transformation from being incompatible because of sin nature, not matching with God's holiness, to sharing his nature through sonship. In other words, they are changed from being unresponsive to God and incompatible to being responsive to the grace of God and being compatible. How did this happen? This didn't happen because of blood. No one gets into a relationship with God based on the credential of physical descent. Being born a Jew or being born into a believing couple is not a way to spiritual relationship with God. Old Testament examples like Esau, Ishmael, and the sons of Keturah are an evidence for that. Spiritual relationship doesn't happen by the will of the flesh. Relationship with God isn't something that we who live in the sinful flesh or flesh that is prone to sin desire because we in our natural desires have our likes and tastes that are contrary to the desires of God. Our being delights in sin so much that it is impossible to will towards a spiritual relationship. Then the next phrase we find here is not of the will of man. If we have to enjoy the status of being God's children, there is nothing we can do to create it. Just like we don't have the choice to be born physically, our physical birth is because of our parents' choice. This is why Jesus deliberately uses the phrase being born again to convey that men cannot do anything within their power to enjoy sonship that God provides. The fourth thing we see in this verse is but of God. Our spiritual relationship with God that Jesus gives is a miracle, keeping in mind the following reasons. Anyone from any region of the world gets to enjoy this relationship with God, not just the Jews. Second, God changes our natural disposition towards sin and instills a hatred for sin and a love towards Him. This change is impossible to be created with a stand-alone ability of our flesh. This change will enable a person to positively respond to the signs in the book of John. The third thing we need to keep in mind is that being born again is not our choice. It's His choice. And by being born again through His choice, we have His DNA passed on to us. We don't choose to be born again. God gives us a spiritual birth by means of our faith. We will eventually learn that even the ability to believe is His gift. And the next part of this section comes in verse 14 to 18. The entry of the Creator into the realm of His creation. This is an explanation of verse 9 that speaks on the arrival of the true light. Here are a few facts that we need to observe in this section, in verse 14 to 18. The Word, though He is a person, He is a spirit being. In His pre-existence, He has always existed as a spirit being, as a spiritual being, having all the incommunicable attributes that belongs to God. This spiritual being, this Son of God, who didn't have a human flesh prior to His incarnation, He became flesh. This is one of the most remarkable events in all of history. Its importance is magnified by the fact that the Creator God, the Son, who is a spirit being, took on a human nature with all of its characteristics, except for sin. except for sin. We must note that Jesus, the Son of God, didn't stop being God at His incarnation. From this moment in time, Jesus will be fully God and fully man, something that is described in the theological circles as the hypostatic union. And from the moment of His incarnation, He will remain fully God and fully man or for all of eternity future. At this point, He never sacrificed His deity for His humanity. The third thing we need to realize is that He dwelt among us. Literally, that passage or that verse means is translated is like it goes like this: He pitched His tent among us. It is an allusion to the function of the tabernacle in the Old Testament. The tabernacle was a visible manifestation of his residence among his people. Now God was dwelling among people, not through any earthly objects, but through the person of his Son, the incarnate Word. And the fourth thing here is that we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father. Jesus has a unique sonship with the Father, as in he has all the attributes of the Father. The phrase only Son, monogenes, specifies a one-of-a-kind, unique sonship that no one else has, just like Isaac is the only son of Abraham, as per Genesis 22 verse 2. If one needed to have a glimpse of the Father and his glory, they needed to have a glimpse or take a look at Jesus. He alone possesses the divine glory for all the world to witness. The next thing we see in this verse is full of grace and truth. Keeping in mind the mention of Moses and the allusion to the tabernacle, grace and truth is a Greek allusion to the phrase steadfast love and faithfulness in the Old Testament. In Jesus Christ, man has the fullness of God's steadfast love and faithfulness. Man receives grace in its abundance. Now I'm going to present to you a useful information that you need to keep in mind. A common mistake that we often make is that we say there was no grace at the time of Moses when the law came through him, and then grace appeared with the coming of Christ. If that logic has to be applied, then there are a few problems that we face. Verse 17 says, grace and truth came to Jesus, not just grace. To push the logic that there was no grace in the Old Testament, we would have to demand that there was no truth in the law that came through Moses. That's a wrong statement, because everything in the law is a revelation of God and it contained truth, and it was truth. Second thing we need to realize here is that grace is a prevalent concept in the Old Testament. Creation is an act of grace. Noah found grace in God's eyes. The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, they all were recipients of God's grace. Israel was chosen to be God's special people because of grace. To suggest that Jesus brought grace that was never given earlier is a serious misstatement on God's character, because God's character is always the same. So the right way to understand verse 17 is that even though the Old Testament scriptures presented grace and truth clearly, the fullest expression of those things came through Jesus. The law presented the righteous character of God in writing. Jesus presented the righteous character of God in person. That's the difference. The prologue of chapter 1, verse 1 to 18 ends with the statement that no human being has ever seen God, that is, in a full and complete way to comprehend enough to enter into a relationship with Him. That is what it means. People in the Old Testament have seen manifestations of God. What this verse means is that no human being has ever had a vision of God in His full and complete way to comprehend Him enough to enter into a relationship with Him. He is beyond our reach in a way that we can't do anything to bring Him to us. In such a situation, we need to know a few things. Without God self-revealing Himself, we cannot know Him. Only God can reveal God completely. Remember, Moses, Abraham, the law couldn't fully reveal the person of God. Only Jesus could. So why is Jesus the one through whom we can have a complete understanding of who God is? Number one, Jesus shares the divine essence with the Father. Number two, Jesus is in the bosom of the Father. It is a figure of speech denoting the closest relationship with intimate knowledge. With that being said, we conclude the prologue, and in our next video we will look at chapter 1, and we have a few remaining verses talking about the gospel, about the person named John the Baptist. May his name be glorified.